Hello, writers! Have you ever bought a writing craft book someone says you just have to read?
Is it still sitting on your shelf? Have you even cracked the spine?
That's totally me!
Don't ask Renee how many craft books she owns.
Why do we keep buying these books we never read?
We all want to improve as writers, but that's hard to do alone.
That's why we started the Words to Write By podcast, to tackle these books together, chapter by chapter, and learn from their advice.
Or not. Sometimes they're wrong.
Hi, I'm Renee Nelson, former college writing instructor turned full-time writer and podcaster. After many years, I finally have a complete draft of my memoir.
And I'm Kim Smigado, author of the humorous fantasy novel Our Comeback Tour is Slaying Monsters, which is the first book in the Boy Bands and Dragons series, released by Riverfolk Publishing.
And now, on with the podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Words to Write By.
Hi, everybody!
This is a workshop episode. We have a guest. His name is Tim Waggoner, and he's a horror and dark fantasy writer. He's won numerous Bram Stoker awards for his fiction and nonfiction, and he also has adapted several movies, including one of the Resident Evil movies, to novels, which works well with our podcast because right now we're doing a book that's technically for screenwriters.
Right, but also Resident Evil's a video game too. So it's a film, and it's a video game, right?
Yeah. Yep.
I like the Resident Evil movies.
Why don't you tell us about your books, Tim?
Which ones? I've done about like 70 of them at this point.
What's your favorite?
Oh, I don't know if I have a favorite, really. I'm terrible at those kind of questions. People say, what's your favorite or what's your top five? Usually my favorite is like whatever I'm either working on at the moment or just finished. So I just finished doing a Conan the Barbarian book, and that was a lot of fun.
Cool.
So I'll say it's my favorite at the moment.
So we are covering in our regular podcast a book called The Writer's Journey, which uses Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces concepts to plot out, in the author's terms, all modern stories, but I don't necessarily know if it fits.
It's based on mythology. The theory is that all these stories follow some kind of plot line, and they're all very similar to each other. They, focus on a hero, and the hero goes through various steps until they reach the end and come back to their village. So I'm pretty sure you're familiar with it.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think your horror books follow a hero's journey?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that kind of structure is just one that's all of our lives, at least in Western culture. I mean, we absorb that from all of our stories. Even the little, fairy tales and things like that, the three billy goats gruff, the three little pigs, and they're all kind of set up the same way. It's not something I consciously think of anymore. I might have a long time ago, back when Joseph Campbell's program he had on PBS, and everybody was like, oh my God, Joseph Campbell. And so people were really taking a look at it at that point. I've been teaching for 35 years, so I use that when I teach novel writing. We talk about it as one of the ways. It pretty much follows like the classic plot design follows the hero's journey. You can get a lot more complicated with it too. There's a lot more than just the hero has an obstacle, hero reaches their goal after they're tested kind of thing. There's a whole lot of parts to it. I even have a presentation called the Horror Hero's Journey, where we talk about how to use Joseph Campbell's thing, but how it kind of applies to horror. Because in horror, a lot of times your protagonist isn't as active the same way as like Luke Skywalker might be or somebody. And they probably wouldn't be doing anything if something hadn't imposed itself on their life somehow. They're more reactive, at least to start. So there's like some differences because of the way horror works. But in general, yeah, I would say my horror does tend to follow that.
We were talking in our podcast about the ordeal stage. It's also called the crisis stage. Can you give some examples of how you've had that kind of stage in your books, given that they're horror, not standard heroic fantasy?
That's a really good question. You passed it on to me through email. I've been thinking about it. I don't know if I consciously think about it when I write. I mean, I'm really aware of it in movies. My daughters are like 30 and 25, and when they were little, I spoiled them because I go, and here comes the act 3, because it's right after the midnight of the soul for the character. And I'm like, just watch, they're going to change the color and it's going to be brighter too. They're like, you've ruined movies for us, Dad. So, I try not to be so obvious about it. I think in a lot of ways, that kind of thing works better in film because film keeps moving at its own pace and you have to keep up with it. But with a book, you can stop, you can think about it. You're probably not going to read a whole novel in a sitting, although, some novels are short enough that you can, but probably most people don't. And so I think that sometimes those themes are a lot more obvious in written fiction than they might be in the movies. So I try not to be too obvious about how to do it. And also for myself, too, because I just don't want to get in a rut and using the same exact pattern for every single book. But yeah, usually there does come a point where the protagonist is just kind of all on their own, or they might have an ally with them, and it's the worst point. Whether they're going to come back from it or not, you don't know. And in my horror, I always give it like a twisted happy ending. So maybe not be what most people might think of as happy, but the characters probably do, or at least I do. So I do try to play around with those kind of things and, sometimes invert them and do other things with them. But yeah, I do think that my horror does have that in it.
At what point do you put that crisis, the worst point for the hero, for your protagonist? Do you put it like in the very middle of the story, or do you put it closer to the very end of the story?
Say closer to the end. I mean, there's a whole process. It's almost like peeling an onion, where the layers keep getting pulled off until it's just the hero, where all kinds of things have happened in terms of things that they've lost or they've become more isolated. They don't have anybody else to go to, especially in horror. You have to have reasons why they don't have allies or they can't call the cops or why they would even want to go into the dark place. They have to have a really compelling reason. They're not going to enrich themselves or save the world. Maybe they are, but they're just regular everyday people. Even if they want to save the world, they might have a hard time doing it. I usually have things that tear down, kind of break down the story and the characters. So there's not a whole lot left other than just this last horrible thing that they have to deal with and whether they're going to do it or not. And usually that's not just a horrible thing on the outside for them. It's usually stuff inside them too, to make it even worse and even harder.
Those are all good techniques to engage the audience. Are there any particular techniques that you use in horror that maybe a standard fantasy or science fiction writer might not use?
Yeah, I think that you need to have something that really compels the protagonist in horror because there's a transition point from when they are passive to when they become active. Because if they stay passive the entire time, then they're just a victim and you're just watching them be a victim. A lot of times, I think people, when they start writing horror, that's what they do. And it's weird because, we read so much of it, we watch so much of it, but we don't absorb all that. We can't just read a book and then go write a book. Humans just don't work that way. If we could do that, we'd watch like a pro football game and go out in the backyard and we could do all those things. Maybe not the conditioning of our bodies, but the techniques and other stuff we'd remember. It just doesn't work that way. It takes a lot of practice and repetition and trying to learn it from the inside out. And so I think a lot of people, when they first sit down to write horror, they just think, okay, somebody's a victim. And they tell the story of how this person was victimized by this horrible force or this other person, and the end. In a horror novel, especially, there needs to be a sort of a pivot point where the character moves from being passive, or at least mostly passive, to being active. Otherwise, the story doesn't really have as much impact. You can probably get away in a short story, with a passive character. Even in short stories, I still try to have a pivot point, even if it's just in the last couple pages where the character is trying to confront something. There's this point that I call the confrontation point in horror, which is where you have to face it, whatever it is. And then the hero's journey, that's when you go in the cave, and that's where the thing is in the cave, the beast or whatever you're going to call it in the hero's journey, depending how it's labeled by different writers. So in a horror, it can be, you know, you're going into the basement, you're going to the monster's lair, but it can also just be metaphorical, where you're going into yourself or you're just accepting that you're going to be dealing with that.
So I met you at the conference.
Mm-hmm.
It was World Fantasy Conference out in Buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
And I took your workshop, how to build a monster or how to make a monster. It was really cool because I'm actually currently making monsters.
Thanks. Oh, cool.
And so I was just kind of wondering, we were just reading in the book we're reviewing about the Ordeal, and it talks about the villain. But I was wondering, like, how do you design a good villain? You were just mentioning, like, oh, it could be metaphorical or all these things where they're like that the hero has to approach and then, deal with whatever the ordeal is. And it's interesting because Vogler was saying things like, oh, they have to be the complete opposite of the hero in some way or another. They reflect the hero, but in opposite ways. And I was just wondering, do you keep the hero in mind? Like, okay, there's a hero. What kind of antagonist can I make that'll match with this hero? Or do you just like create a monster and then you're like, all right, I'm just going to pick this dude and they're going to be the hero and they're going to have to survive?
Yeah, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the opposite. The things like that work better for like kids' cartoons where everybody is just sort of a type. The kids, they don't have a lot of sophistication in terms of being an audience, and they can't because they're still experiencing the world. Their thought processes are different. So you want to have, relatively simple stories. And if you're making movies for a mass audience, you want it to be relatively simple too, so it appeals to the widest variety of people. But if you're just doing like complete opposite, um, I think it's really obvious. I try not to do that. I like it if the villain is, or the force, or whatever it is, can interact with the character, because I think that's more interesting than if just something that just jumps out and tries to eat you. Um, Although I've written a couple creature feature books, that's what happens. In that case, usually what I'll do is I'll have like a human villain as well.
Kind of like Minions or whatever.
Yeah, it could be that, or even just somebody who you're trying to survive with. You've all seen that character where it's like you can't depend on them because they'll be the one that pushes you right into the mouth of the shark and then run. That kind of character. Yeah, usually I think more in terms of image in a lot of ways in horror. So I might have this really cool idea of, okay, this is sort of like what they're going to confront at the end, and here's what it's going to look like. It's sort of like a skin, like in a video game, because really all it is just this is the force that they're going to encounter. And so, what's its skin this time? How does that impact the character? And that's different depending on what it may be. If it's a ghost of like your great grandmother you remember from when you were a child, it's going to have much more of an impact on you if that's the opposing force than if it's just some random ghost that you never heard of. And I always try to give the characters some kind of emotional connection, personal connection to what's happening. So if it's like a character just stumbles into this force, well, that's okay. That's one thing. But if you don't give them some kind of connection to it, that's why I think that Poltergeist works really well. Because the whole thing, once we find out what the reason for all this is it's the dad's real estate company and the stuff that they've done. But the other personal connection is it's in their home. And also, Carol Ann gets sucked up into the ghost dimension. And it's like one of the few scripts I can tell was written by a parent because they send their older daughter away because they don't need her. They're going to stay, but they're not risking her. And most Hollywood movies, if they have kids, it's like the adults just drag the kids right into danger with them. And I'm like, no, there's no way in hell I would do that with my daughters.
Although sometimes it can be really hard to find childcare.
That's true. Well, that would be the good thing about the ghost dimension. You just send Carol Ann there for the day, and then maybe they can send her back about 5 o'clock. That worked pretty well.
Something that you said earlier really pinged me. You said that a lot of writers make the mistake of having their main characters in horror films or horror books be passive, and you can't do that. But at the same time, they are in danger at every stage. They are, to an extent, victimized throughout it. What techniques do you use, or maybe what mindset do you have to keep a character who's in danger all the time from being passive?
Well, they still can be passive until they get to that pivot point. But one of the things is that you can be passive in the sense of you don't want to confront this thing, but that means you're trying to do everything you can to avoid confronting it. Depending on what kind of thing it is, you could just shut your eyes, or you could run, or you could refuse to believe that it exists. There's all kinds of things people do, and those are active. It's like Hamlet. Everybody talks about Hamlet's indecision, but he's actively trying to decide. He's actively wrestling with all of this stuff before there's that pivot point about 2/3 of the way through or so, where he finally decides he needs to take action. Even though that's not a horror story, even though it's got ghosts in it and murder and stuff, but it does have something, similar to that. We have the character interacting with these forces, in which case for him, it's like, what's going on? What's happening? Is it really what I think it is? What's the best way to do it? Should I do anything? How can I do it? So I think that having your character be actively trying to resist, actively trying to deny, actively trying to escape, or if they're trying to deal with it, to try to deal with it in the simplest way possible, or in a way that we see this in horror movies all the time. It's the way we know is not going to work. It's like, why are you even going to try this? We know that you're not going to stop Jason this way. They don't know, but we know. You can keep them active. And the other thing you can do too is, and I do this for any kind of fiction, is that make everything conflict. Like when characters are talking, don't ever have them agree right away. If characters are outside, make it be cold and they're uncomfortable because that's conflict. You can do all kinds of things. Fiction is like they're gigantic conflict processing machines, and you can have conflict on all kinds of levels. And that way, your character can be more active. Plus, in horror stories, venture stories of any kind, characters, they have lives, they have things that were going on. They are swept up in this. And so they may have other things that they need to deal with. Maybe they do have their kid with them. Maybe it's like mostly an adult kid who won't go away at this point. Or maybe, they're forced to be in there with their ex. And so they have to deal with some of those issues. As much as they're trying to put them aside, maybe they can't. So it could be all kinds of things that still keeps a character active in different ways, but they're not actively going to be standing up to this thing until they get to the certain point at the end.
Yeah, I remember. So I don't know, some years ago, I've seen Alien a million times. I really love Sigourney Weaver. I was with a friend. I don't know how many times she'd seen it, but we were watching it and she was commenting how Ripley seemed very passive in the beginning of the movie. And I got really mad at her. I was like, what are you talking about? She's like telling him not to go out there. She's like the one shutting the doors. Every time she's the one telling him, don't do this or don't do that or making these decisions. I got really mad. I'm like, she's awesome. She's not passive. So anyway, you're saying this, you just kind of like confirmed.
You're right.
Yeah, she's a wonderful example of that.
Yeah.
Where she gets to the point where, she has to deal with it.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, my favorite TV show was the Night Stalker, Kolchak the Night Stalker. And he was a reporter. He would, stumble across, oh, there's a vampire, there's a mummy, whatever. And his whole point was just to learn the truth and try to get people to acknowledge the truth and try to get somebody to deal with this thing. And nobody would. So finally, by the end, he's like, okay, screw it. There's nobody else.
Yeah.
And also he was compelled to see, compelled to experience the truth. And then, of course, nobody ever believed his stories by the time it was done. But that's the thing I liked about him as a hero. It was just because there was nobody else. There was only him. He would have been perfectly happy to have the army or the cops go in and take care of this, sewer dwelling monster if they could, if he could get somebody to do it. A lot of times horror characters are like that. They become heroes only because there's nobody else or only because they kind of have to. I mean, if you think about it, how many people, say to themselves, okay, I want to go out and face a terminal disease today and prove myself. You don't. You would much rather never have anything like that happen to you or your loved ones. There's a lot of stuff that we have either have to or we still don't or whatever, but stuff we're forced somehow to deal with, even if we deal with it by avoidance or denial. I think that the idea of saying a character is passive just because they don't grab their sword and run straight at the thing, and try to hack it to bits, I don't think that's true. I think that Ripley's a really good example of that in the first movie.
So, going a little bit in a slightly different direction, you were talking about how a movie has certain pacing, that you're moving through time. So, you're sitting and watching a whole movie, and that affects the way the climax works. That affects the way the various act structure works, but that you don't have those elements in writing a novel. So, how do you go about taking a movie script that has all those beats and making it just as exciting in novel form?
Well, most scripts, because I've done 9 of them now, 9 novelizations, and most scripts, they aren't long enough to make a movie. I did the X trilogy movies, X, Pearl, and Maxine. Ty West, the writer director, one of the things he wanted to have happen was that I only wrote the script, I only dramatized the script. I added nothing. And those books, each one of them is about 40,000 words, and they could not be any longer. And that's about how long most scripts, if they're going to fit hour and a half, 2 hours, if you're lucky, there's going to be some extra scenes in the script that weren't filmed. So that helps. But you still end up having to make stuff up. And so you create the rhythm, not of the movie, but try to create a rhythm for that book as best you can. You still have the overall structure of the story, but you can find other kind of beats within it. And sometimes what you can do too is the same thing you do with any novel. You can have like the mini hero's journey in a scene. It doesn't have to be all the stuff, but this is the scene where this is the goal they have to achieve, the sub goal. If you treat novels that way, they're almost like a bunch of little interconnected stories by the time they get to the climax. And if you're lucky, your readers don't notice that. But you can do the same thing with novelizations.
When you're watching movies, sometimes the climax or the really big moments are big because you got the music soundtrack and you've got the loud noises and you've got the close in of the hero and you maybe have all the special effects and all this cool stuff is happening. How do you get that same effect on paper? Is it just you choose the right words?
Um, if there's an atmosphere you want to try that the music is creating and the lighting is creating, the cinematography is creating, you can try to find a way to replicate that with your descriptions. The best way for me to do it is to just write with a close point of view, like I always do. So if I stay in somebody's head when I write that, I can go ahead and filter whatever's going on in terms of all that emotional stuff, which I think we're supposed to sort of be in the person's head kind of in a way to get that same feeling. Like if we were there, this is the kind of stuff we would be feeling, and the music helps and the lighting helps and all that. If this person was a real person and they were really here and this was really happening, what would they be thinking and feeling? I've been lucky with the last few novelizations I've done. The movies have already been out. So I've got the actor's performance to help a lot. When you have the script and you've not seen the movie and you have no idea, you have to do the best you can based on just what's there. But I just write it like fiction at that point. And I know that it'll be a different experience. But that's what's cool about novelizations. I mean, you don't want the exact same experience as the movie because the movie already exists. You want something that's, going to give you a different perspective on it or a different way to experience the film.
So so it's fascinating. So I'm always railing or like annoyed, especially with this book, Christopher Vogler. He's always using movies, which he's focused on movies, but it says for writers. And once in a while, he'll throw the novelist a bone. And he'll throw a novel out there. Oh yeah, we forgot. There's also novels that follow this. If I hear Harry Potter or Star Wars as an example one more time on how to write a novel plot, they don't seem similar enough. I mean, already the script itself and a movie is limited, how many words you're able to tell the story in a novel. I mean, how comparative are they? I mean, do you think it's a bad idea to like,
Study movies to get tricks on how to write novels?
yeah,
There are things you can do and techniques you can use, but you can't just try to write a movie. I think a lot of newer writers, that's what they wish they could do is make a movie. But it's easier just to sit at your computer and type words. And they probably would rather write a script, but they're not really sure how. So they sort of write it as best they can as a story. But it's really mostly kind of sort of a movie script. So, yeah, I think that you need to figure out, what's the best ways to write a novel. It's difficult for readers to just the average reader to do literary fiction because it doesn't follow any particular pattern or structure. It's whatever the writer decides is best for that story at that time. Your readers have grown up with thousands upon thousands of hours more of visual media than they have of text reading. And so they've absorbed how stories are told through movies. And so there's a lot that we do that makes fiction so different now. If you look at a novel from 100, 200 years ago, like in Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence, there's all these pages about like the dinner settings and everything going on. And it's because the readers need to be able to picture it because they have no memory bank of images from a billion films to draw on. I can say palm tree and I don't have to describe it anymore. But how many people 200 years ago have ever seen a palm tree? They never have. How many of them has ever seen a painting of one or a drawing of one if there hadn't been photography yet? The way those things were written are so different because they're different readers. If you know that your readers have, they understand, what a jump cut is. So they could understand that you end a chapter at one place and you start it a day later and you don't even have to say anything. Where somebody in the early days of fiction would not have understood that. They were like, how come you didn't tell us what happened in the night? How come you didn't tell us what happened in the morning? They didn't understand skipping parts. They'd never skipped anything. They didn't have anything that really skipped. Closest thing probably be the Bible, but usually those things would be taken out of context probably as lessons and little bits and pieces here and there. It's not like it'd be one consecutive reading experience probably for most people. And most people would have somebody read it to them probably back then. So yeah, I think you just need to be careful. The thing too is there's just stuff you cannot do. We cannot do the music. We cannot do the feel of somebody's scream. If you watch Hereditary, Toni Collette's performance in that movie, I mean, I've never seen a more raw portrayal of grief ever. And there's no way in hell anybody could ever do that in a novel. You can't. So you try to find the things that only a novel can do. And that's that kind of interiority that you get from a character. I think you want to try to like blend, like balance it as best you can. I don't know how true this is yet, but I'm starting to see articles that are talking about how interiority is starting to disappear from fiction. And it's because I think that more and more people, it's just movies, it's just TV shows, it's just video games, and it's just everything has to happen fast because their social media is fast and short, and people don't have the same kind of, I know they don't have the same kind of attention span, but it's even more different. And I don't know if that's going to be a thing that's going to keep happening. But like in 100 years from now, I think they'll still be reading fiction because it does something that other media can't do yet. You help to create the story in a lot of ways. You are interacting with it in a way that you don't when you're a passive observer, like in film and TV. But I still think it might be very different than what we have now. And that's okay. I mean, stories are for the people that are around now. But yeah, I don't know what I'll do because I'm like, well, hell, interiorities. I have a real balance of that with the stuff that goes on in the outside world. And I don't know what will happen.
Wow, I hadn't thought about that. That's kind of a little scary.
But
Yeah.
the future is scary.
The future is, I mean, yeah, everyone's scared of the future a little bit.
And it could just be a fad. It could just be a thing. It's hard to say if anything like that's going to stay.
Yeah.
You never know.
So I love asking this question. So our shtick for our podcast is we read a craft book and we discuss it and we talk smack about it, whatever. Or we say, oh, this is great advice. Do you recommend any craft books, or what is your favorite craft book if you have one?
Yeah, in general, the ones that have affected me over the years are from Lawrence Block, the mystery writer. He used to write the monthly column in Writer's Digest on fiction writing many years ago, and most of his how to write books are kind of just collections of those columns. But I found them, so useful back then that for me they are still foundational. Otherwise, it kind of depends on what people are looking for. There's a book, Aristotle for Screenwriters by Michael Tierno. I like that one because it has things in there that there are concepts in there that work really well to try to help people understand, like, how do you have a core idea that can drive an entire novel? And I found that way to describe it more easily in his book. Like that one. I think that one works pretty good.
And you've written some craft books yourself. You want to tell us about those?
Yeah, I've wrote Writing in the Dark, which is about how to write horror, and I did a workbook for that. And then I did one, it's called Let Me Tell You a Story, where I talk about stories throughout my career and what I did to write them at the time and what I do differently now. And I got one coming out. It's about writing media tie-ins. It's called Just Add Writer. And maybe the next 6 months. It's not up for pre-order yet, but it should be soon.
3 craft books. That's impressive.
Before you go on, do you tell us some of your other books and where we can find them?
You can find my books like pretty much any online retailer. My website, timwaggoner.com, is the best place. I write original, horror and dark fantasy. I write tie-ins that are like, it could be a book with Sam and Dean from Supernatural, but it's a new adventure of theirs. And then I also do novelizations where I take a script of a movie and then, turn that into a book. And I write short stories too. So,
Cool.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us.
oh, sure.
And I learned I wasn't even thinking I was going to ask you, but were very useful.
Yeah, and I'm gonna go, get a couple craft books now, unfortunately, because I have so many, but I'll get more.
But I have so many too.
Do you read them all?
Sometimes I'll pick through them and sometimes I'll get ones to look at to see if I want to recommend it to a student to classes. Or if a student tells me they're having a certain problem, I'll kind of pick a craft book out. One I really like is called Plot and Character, I think. It talks about the false dichotomy of how like popular fiction writers focus on plot, literary writers focus on character, and it's about, no, you should be focusing on both. It's really good when I find a student that has trouble with one or the other. And so I always recommend that one. But that's why I got that one, is because I had students with that issue. So I kind of read them, and some are on my shelves that look nice, and maybe someday I'll read them, but I'm going to die with a bunch of books unread, like pretty much all of us.
Yeah.
Mm.
Cool. Well, we thank you so much. This was so helpful. This was a
Oh,
great discussion. I'm so excited. I love Resident Evil. I haven't read a novel of it, but I'm gonna read one now.
that one takes place. It's the very last movie they did, and because they didn't have a transition between the second to last and the last movie, I wrote a 60-page mini movie at the start of that as a as a transition between them. I had no clue if they'd let me keep it or not, but they did. So if you've seen those movies, you might get a kick out of that.
One more question.
Sure.
So I have a book club. I would like to read one of your horror stories, but I am actually kind of really afraid.
Mhm.
Is there like a horror light book that you have?
What's your least scary book?
Scary book.
Well, it came out a while ago, and I think it's only in print now as an ebook. But I did a series of fun urban fantasies. The first one's called Necropolis. It's like a horror world, but it's more of an urban fantasy, and it's lighter. I think
Okay.
that one can work pretty good.
Just don't want nightmares.
Mhm.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.
Words to Write By is produced by Renee Nelson and Kim Smiga Adam. Our theme music is Roll Back the Carpet by Cool Cat Music. Have a great day.
Can I ask about a craft book?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay.